have learned today, causes of lameness are multifactorial. So whilst we should be looking at genetics, diet, flooring, what we also perhaps are not noticing are hoof problems in sows, and they are actually, I think, a lot more common than any of us would dare to realise. The hoof actually serves as a protective structure to the sow, puts her weight on it. So obviously, common sense really, if this protective structure is damaged or showing openings, we have a very rich blood supply under there, and then we have real potential for injury and infection. What we also seem to see on farms is that when we have a sow with perhaps poor conformation in her hooves, or she has overgrown hooves, she's actually perhaps redistributing how she's standing on that foot in terms of the weight. That can be putting stresses on other areas of the hoof, which can ultimately lead to lameness or more damage. And also the same for if she's got a problem with one foot, she's also putting perhaps more weight bearing on other areas which can lead to lameness. But exactly how much hoof lesions contribute to lameness, I think, is at present still unknown, but it is work in progress. So what are we talking about when we look at hoof lesions? Well, here's just some examples, and these pictures were taken from the Zimpro Corporation website because they've done a lot of work actually classifying different hoof lesions and developing a simple scale. So just some examples here. We've got wall cracks, long toes and heel erosion. But we also look at white line cracks, which is a separation between the sole and the hoof wall, and also overgrowth of the heel. And also we have wall cracks which can be horizontal. And as you can see, the scale that Zimpro developed is a way to assess the severity of these. So a 0 would be a healthy hoof. And I have a little picture in the bottom corner here of what we would see as a more healthy hoof. Toes aren't too long, don't have any cracks. And then in terms of what we would class as more unhealthy, this crack in the wall is mild, it's short, doesn't look too deep. We have a moderate one, getting a lot longer, and a severe crack, in which has gone very deep and long. In terms of the long toes, as you can see, we can have one or both toes going longer. Same with the dew claws as well, that's a separate area. And what Zimpro produced a very nice colour guide with regards to hoof lesions. And what they've actually found when they've opened up these feet is that if you have long toes, especially on all four feet, it's probably actually more systemic laminitis that's going on in the hoof, and so there's a lot of inflammation. So when we think about laminitis, that sow is probably also pretty uncomfortable. And long toes in particular can actually make it very difficult for the sow to walk. You often see them doing quite a big scooping action to almost pick their feet up more to stop them getting caught on these toes. And heel erosion in particular, very common and often opens up to a lot of cracks and infection. So you can understand how these sows, and I think we've all seen it, trying to move a sow, she's reluctant to move on certain floors, especially on a slippery metal or plastic floor in a farrowing crate. How do we expect our piglet mortality due to crushing to improve if our sows are not able to actually stand up properly? So, hoof trimming itself, we might say crazy concept for sows, but not necessarily, because let's look at other livestock industries, and they actually do a lot of trimming. So we are more familiar with dairy cattle, in particular horses. We do a lot of trimming and even apply shoes to try and protect the feet. Whether that's a good idea anymore is perhaps being debated. And for sheep, indeed, it's common known with foot rot problems, keep the overgrowth trimmed down. So it's actually an important maintenance side, so why do we not do it with sows? Well, I found this on the internet from a New Zealand study. As you can perhaps realise, that restraining a sow to trim her hooves is probably a highly unpleasant process, and one in which ear defenders are required. And I think it would not be worth anyone's stress, nor the labour involved to try and restrain a sow to actually give her feet a proper trim. But certainly, hoof trimming is perhaps still worth it, because the demands that we make on a sow metabolically, even if we have good genetics, good feeding, good flooring, I don't know if we are aware still whether we will still have to do some sort of trimming for certain types of sows, certain barns that may have a problem. So the feet first chute that was developed by the Zimpro Corporation in the United States now actually provides a means where we can restrain a sow and we can trim the hooves. So this is just to show you the chute here. So she actually walks into this crated area. It has a central bar which is padded, which goes underneath her. Her legs are on either side, and then it has a hydraulic lift which, well, it winches her up actually, and then she is suspended off the floor. She cannot argue with it. And generally the sows are just very calm and they actually will just hang there. Then you can get a footstool and a head torch on, and you can have a proper examination of her hooves, and you can also fairly easily hold the hoof to apply a trim. So there is now a viable way to restrain a sow if a farm has particular problems, and this is something they want to address. So, when we're looking at hoof trimming, prevention obviously is better than cure, and both claw size and hoof growth, it has been indicated, could be relevant genetic selection factors, especially for group housed sows. But in looking at a holistic approach to solving foot problems, hoof trimming could remain part of our management practice if required. So I think work is ongoing in a number of institutions to try and determine which is the best approach to take. And we got hold of a hoof trimmer when we heard about it to really see what could we do on a large barn. So we developed a study that had 3 specific objectives: to go on to a large sow herd and to actually look at the prevalence of lameness on that sow herd, look at the condition of the hooves, and then try to determine what could we exactly do by incorporating trimming into a management practice. So we first assessed the prevalence and types of lameness on a large commercial herd. We then measured the impact of hoof trimming as a preventative treatment for lameness, and then we finally assessed whether actually treating lame sows with hoof trimming could help reduce lameness. The study location, we chose a very large herd, 6,000 sow, the reason being that we hope to be able to increase the number of lame sows that we had in that population, more to select from. And observations that we made and treatments were given around the barn schedule. This is so we can actually have a practical application of the treatments. The sows were stall housed, and they were housed on part slatted concrete flooring, so solid along the shoulders to 3/4 and then slats at the back. And they had metal slats in the farrowing room. So our initial part of the study was to actually say what sort of lameness do we have going on here. So the sow herd was surveyed each week for the duration of the trial. We observed sows walking from breeding to gestation, around 300 sows per week. Because this is research and we want to do a good job, we then individually took each sow out of her gestation stall when the barn had finished with her, and we rescored them individually in a solid floored corridor. A gate score was assigned to each sow. We thought we're using the Zimpro chute, so let's use their scoring system. So this lameness scoring system, 0 to 3. 0 being perfectly sound, free moving, non-lame. 1 being problem is there, she's clearly sore, can be difficult, you might get the occasional head bob that she's, just felt it, but it's not consistent. And then a score of 2 is a more defined lameness, you can tell she's lame on, say, her left fore. And then a score of 3, the sow is practically non-ambulatory, she's very reluctant to move, very pronounced lameness. So all sows also received a hoof score from 0 to 3, did she have a good hoof condition, mild, moderate, severe lesion, and for each of these lesions we looked at hoof wall cracks, heel erosion, light lines, long toes, dew claws. And we tried to identify the cause of lameness, but as you probably know, very difficult unless you actually do an autopsy. So, to look at the results, in total we surveyed 3,541 sows. So this was only really a year-long study, and this was actually 59% of the herd we managed to survey. And we actually found that 54% of those sows were observed with an abnormal gait, so a score of 1. So they were showing signs of discomfort. Hard to tell, but they were not correct. We don't believe it was due to, we took them out of the stalls and we allowed them to walk around for a long time, so any stiffness, that, unless it was caused by lameness, should have been eliminated. So 6% of sows was showing very clear lameness on at least one leg, so a very pronounced head bob, very pronounced area to say that leg is lame. And 0.23%, as we would like, very few, were severely lame. And 26% of the sows surveyed were lame between parities 0 to 3. This is far higher than we expected, but I guess it's not until you really start to look, you start to uncover stuff. So let's look at the hoof lesions that we saw. 46% of sows had long dew claws, and these were pictures from the barn. We had 85% of sows that had heel overgrowth. I put a star by there because these were surveying sows as part of the survey, so unless they were lying down, it was very difficult to get a proper assessment of the heel overgrowth. So we did try and go back later in the day, but then we couldn't catch them. This is only the sows who were able to see the underside of their foot. 54% of sows had white line cracks, and 33% of sows had hoof wall cracks. And hoof lesions in total were present on 94% of sows. So when we look at the hoof lesions, certain lesions are more prevalent and severe on hind feet. So in particular, heel overgrowth, white line cracks, hoof wall cracks being more evident on the forefeet, and long toes, longer, worse problems seen on the hind feet. And when we look at parities 0 to 3, it's very interesting to see. We looked at a range of parities, but what about the young girls? 86% of these had hoof lesions. So to me, it's really starting to question, why do we have sows so young with problems? I can understand more perhaps parity 2 and 3, she's been in that system a while. But if a parity 0 as well has hoof lesions, what's going on with our gilt development? What type of flooring or what type of nutrition are these gilts receiving to have a hoof quality that is already damaged so early? Or is it being damaged in transport? This particular farm is buying in gilts. These are questions we need to ask. So when we look at the hoof lesion severity, this is a sort of a basic graphical presentation, but I need to do some more work looking at individual lesions here. But there appears to be no clear lesion between hoof lesion severity and gait score. So we look at the first trial, which looked at preventative hoof trimming, and this was to measure the impact of hoof trimming on non-lame sows. So sows that were showing a score of 0, were they able to maintain a score of 0, or did they deteriorate? So we looked at 200 sows. The reason we did only 200 is that working on a commercial farm, this was a bit more intensive, so we tried to do as much as we could around their management. They were gait score of 0 at 4 to 5 weeks when we brought them in. They were matched for parity in hoof lesions, and 100 of these sows received trims, and this was done at 8 to 9 weeks, and this was to provide more comfort to the barn that they were further along in gestation, so we wouldn't cause any productivity losses. And again, we gait scored them, and we gait scored them again at 10 to 13 weeks, and then we took their productivity at 16 weeks. And the control sows received no trim. So we actually asked our technician, we had a technician employed on site to score the hoof lesions before and after trimming. There's actually a way of obtaining data on what the hoof trimming does. So the hoof trimming procedure significantly reduces the severity of lesions of the sow. So again, this tells us more about the process and how severe the lesions could be. Obviously stuff like toe length and dew claw length, very easy to instantly reduce that down. You nip off the end of the toe, you can then sand the rest down. With regards to heel erosion, it often reveals more problems underneath when you start to try and trim it down. And the same for white line separation and wall cracks. Obviously that crack has probably gone a lot deeper, so it requires more treatments. Some lesions then require more trim. We need to perhaps develop more comprehensive treatment protocols. And the lesions also, good to remember, may not be the sole cause of lameness. So when we look at the trial results between treatments, so the sows were not lame at the start of gestation, and when we came to look at them at 13 weeks, there was no difference in the percentages of sows lame over the weeks observed. So disappointing, but this was a first stab. And what you can see is that there were fewer number of sows that were showing some signs of lameness at 13 weeks. There was no significant difference. So when we go to then the productivity data, we actually also found no difference in the productivity between the control and treatment groups. So this is positive as well, that the hoof trimming and perhaps stress there didn't cause any productivity losses. But also, we would have liked to see differences, but maybe this is because we didn't have a significant difference in lame sows as well in the treatment, so we didn't see anything. So there has been some results in papers actually relating hoof lesions to crushing in sows. So I tried to look at some of this data. At the moment I was unable to find a relationship between hoof lesions and mortality for that particular set of sows. So the second trial we go to is to look at hoof trimming in lame sows as part of a comprehensive treatment to try and get them back on their feet. And we call this the early detection and treatment, but really I suppose we were just looking at lame sows, and they could have been lame for goodness knows how long. So we looked at 200 sows that had a gait score of 1 to 3, so mild to severe. 100 sows were monitored, and they were given a hoof trim, a rubber mat in the stall to provide relief from the concrete and provide a cushioned surface, and they received 2 anti-inflammatory injections. And this was really, we know that if they have a severe problem, 2 anti-inflammatory injections aren't going to solve it, but what it can do is, if the body is in a constant inflammatory response, to actually break that cycle temporarily and start to help generate the healing process. So in terms of our timeline, we again kept it the same as the first trial, so we scored them at 4 to 5 weeks when they came out of breeding. They then received their rubber mat in the stall, identified as lame. They received their first NSAID injection. At 8 weeks, we then gave them a hoof trim, and if necessary and still lame, we gave them another NSAID injection, and then we again lame scored them at 13 weeks. And then we took another 100 sows, and they received no treatment. And again, we matched the sows for parity, severity of lameness between the treatments. And then we took 100 additional control sows that were a score of 0, and these sows did not show any signs of lameness, and that was to actually give a production performance comparison. So when we just show you a bit of the breakdown, we had 70% of these lame sows with a score of 1. That's really what we kind of went for, because if you go for something that's too lame, you don't know if you're going to have any treatment effect at all. It could be too far gone. 28% of sows had a score of 2, and a very small percentage of sows had a very severe score of 3. So when we look at the breakdown and percentage of sows between the control and treatment over the weeks, we actually, by week 13, were able to significantly reduce the number of sows that were showing lameness. So we not only significantly reduced the number of sows, some went to being non-lame, we actually reduced the severity of the gait score when we look at the average gait score over the weeks. When we look at this breakdown, we don't really have any differences between the treatments still at week 8 when we've had the rubber mat and the NSAID. It wasn't until we applied the hoof trimming as well that by week 13 we saw a big difference. And what that could be, it could be additive treatment, so at this early stage we don't know, but at least we saw something, and that in itself is positive. So when we look at the performance of the lame versus the non-lame sows, actually between our control and treatment groups we didn't see any difference, which is disappointing, but again as a first stab, these girls were already pregnant when we took them on, and then we really were hoping to look at their piglet deaths and mortality, but again we didn't find any difference between our control and treatment groups. When we did then compare the data of these two to our matched control of non-lame sows, we did find differences to draw attention to the piglet deaths, and the fact that the sound sows had fewer piglet deaths and they had more piglets weaned. And could that also be due to crushing? There was no difference in our crushing data here, but again, accuracy of recording, or could it also be related to how much sows are eating and milking ability, etc. If we just take this data and look at the fact that our control or lame sows are producing, weaning on average 6% fewer piglets per year, Ken from Prairie Swine Centre helpfully did some economic analysis of a model he has, which said that if we were looking at production from only the lame sows, this equates to a loss of around $5 per market hog sold if you were selling them from lame sows, and this primarily is accounting from fewer pigs being sold and the overhead costs being spread. There's a lot more analysis that could go on to that, so yeah, just a little taster for now. So in conclusions from this, the farm that we studied, the lameness and the hoof lesions were higher than we actually realised when we first went there. So this was interesting, and really to us it's highlighted a course for more action, to start noticing this, start getting involved and looking at these. This first study was really a one-off to say, we've got a hoof trimmer, what can we do? And it was not able to prove that corrective trimming was protective of lameness in this study, but obviously it was pretty short duration for one gestation. And it's very clear that now we've understood a bit more about the process, that we need to do longer studies. And our plan of action is, because we now have a hoof trimming chute, to get it cleaned up and get it into, say, our barn, where we can easily do longer term studies, because in terms of labour and having staff out there. And then we can assess the full merit of hoof trimming on longevity and productivity when we actually take an approach to look at gilts as they're coming into the chain, looking at problems, correcting problems, and seeing how they go further down the line. So our comprehensive treatment of sows, we found that it was able to reduce lameness and the incidence and severity, which is positive that we threw everything in there and we had a change, but which treatment had the greatest influence, we cannot say at the moment. Obviously, in terms of is it worth it to treat lame sows, if you're going to have to take such drastic measures, it probably isn't worth it. But we need to actually start to pinpoint treatment and pinpoint early detection of lameness, and then what treatments can you apply. In the sense of the performance of lame and non-lame sows, the fact that it differed in piglets weaned is because we have a lot of sows that are still classed as mildly to moderate lameness, that this lameness in itself should not be ignored. So it's not just your sows that are getting to the more severe category that need to be dealt with.